I want you to really listen to this one because what I'm about to walk you through comes straight out of how clinical psychology actually understands toxic relationships, and it might genuinely change the way you handle one in your own life. If you've ever felt like your grip on reality was being quietly loosened, your energy drained bit by bit, your sanity questioned by someone who almost seems to feed off your confusion, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not losing your mind. What you're going through has a name, it's been studied extensively, and understanding it is the first real step toward getting your power back. Before we go further, if this is your first time here and you're finding value in these conversations, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making content like this, and it means more people get access to information that could change how they experience a relationship like this one. A huge amount of what we now understand about narcissistic behavior comes down to one core idea. The person doing the damage is almost never actually reacting to you. They're reacting to something buried inside themselves that they cannot bear to look at directly. Underneath the polished, confident exterior they present to the world sits a version of self that feels fragile, empty, even shameful to them, and they have built an entire life around never having to face it. Controlling the people around them isn't a side effect of that avoidance. It's the primary strategy. If they can manage your perception of reality, they never have to sit with their own. Here's the part that took me a long time to really absorb, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. People who operate this way tend to gravitate almost magnetically toward people who have the exact qualities they've spent a lifetime suppressing in themselves. Genuine empathy, real self-awareness, emotional depth, the capacity to sit with hard feelings instead of running from them. Being close to someone who naturally embodies those traits is deeply uncomfortable for a person like this because it holds up a mirror to everything they've refused to become. And instead of confronting that discomfort honestly, the way a healthy person eventually has to, they project it outward onto you. Your calm becomes something they feel compelled to disrupt. Your clarity becomes something they need to muddy. Your empathy becomes something they learn to exploit rather than reciprocate. The moment you actually understand what's driving this kind of behavior underneath the surface, you stop being at the mercy of it. So stay with me because this next part exposes exactly what someone like this is most afraid of, and it's rarely what people assume. It's worth sitting with that for a second because it reframes almost everything about how you experience this kind of relationship. If their behavior was ever really about you, about something you specifically did wrong, then it would make sense to keep searching for the right words, the right approach, the right version of yourself that finally gets through to them. But if their behavior is actually about something internal, something they've been avoiding long before they ever met you and will likely keep avoiding long after, then no version of you was ever going to be the one that fixes it. That's not a failure on your part. That's simply not a problem you were ever equipped to solve because it was never yours to solve in the first place. Clinically speaking, there tend to be three engines running underneath this pattern. First, a compulsive need for control, so they never have to sit with their own unresolved shame. Second, a bottomless hunger for external validation to keep an inflated, brittle sense of self propped upright. And third, a reliance on confusion as an actual strategy to keep the people around them from ever getting a clean, clear look at who they really are. Control tends to be the engine that drives everything else. They need to manage your perception, steer your emotions, and reshape your version of events because your grounded, authentic sense of self is a direct threat to the false self they've spent years constructing. What research and clinical experience both point to again and again is that people caught in this pattern live with a quiet, constant dread of being truly seen. That's really the root of almost everything they do. They aren't distorting your reality because they feel powerful in some healthy sense. They're doing it because underneath the bravado, they are genuinely afraid, and fear tends to be the last thing they will ever admit to feeling. You'll often see this play out in the smallest, most ordinary moments, not just the big dramatic blow-ups people tend to picture when they hear the word narcissist. It shows up when you calmly state a fact and suddenly find yourself in an argument about whether that fact even happened. It shows up when you set a small boundary and it gets treated like a personal betrayal. It shows up when you try to have a straightforward conversation and somehow walk away from it more confused than when you started, without ever quite being able to pinpoint how that happened. None of that confusion is accidental. It's the predictable output of someone whose entire sense of stability depends on your reality staying just a little bit blurry, just clear enough that you keep trying, but never clear enough that you actually see the pattern for what it is. The need for validation runs on the same underlying wiring. It isn't confidence, even though it's dressed up to look exactly like confidence from a distance. It's much closer to psychological overcompensation, a way of propping up an inflated self-image to cover for something far more fragile sitting underneath it. They don't crave admiration because it genuinely fills them up inside. They crave it because it functions like a temporary patch over a wound that never actually closes on its own. Every compliment works like a quick hit. It fades fast, so they need the next one almost immediately, and the one after that endlessly, without ever reaching a point of actually feeling satisfied. This is part of why relationships with someone like this can feel so exhausting over time, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening on the surface. You're constantly being asked, in ways that are rarely spoken out loud, to supply a certain kind of admiration or reassurance, and the moment you stop supplying it, even briefly, the temperature in the relationship shifts. It isn't that they consciously sit down and decide to extract validation from you like a resource. It's that the extraction has become so automatic, so woven into how they relate to everyone, that they likely don't even experience it as taking something from you. To them, it just feels like how relationships work. But the piece I think is the most disturbing, and honestly the most useful for you to fully understand, is how confusion itself gets weaponized almost like a tool. People stuck in this pattern often deliberately blur the line between what's real and what's manufactured. Why would anyone do that on purpose? Because someone who's confused is dramatically easier to control than someone who's grounded and clear-headed. They want you questioning your own perceptions, your own memory, your own judgment, because your clarity is the single biggest threat to the control they depend on. This is often what people mean when they describe a relationship like this as feeling like walking through fog. You can't quite locate the source of your confusion because it's manufactured on purpose, drip by drip, in a way that's almost impossible to point to in any single moment. It's rarely one big lie that does the damage. It's 1,000 small distortions, a shifted timeline here, a denied conversation there, a reaction that doesn't match what actually happened, stacked up over months and years, until you genuinely stop trusting your own read on reality. That's not a coincidence, and it's not you being overly sensitive or dramatic. That's the entire strategy working exactly as intended. Keep listening, because what comes next, the actual way out of this fog, is going to surprise you with how simple it really is. What decades of work on personality and relational patterns points toward is something we can call reclaiming your own center, becoming fully conscious and integrated in your own right instead of living reactively, constantly tangled up in someone else's projections and distortions. And the practical version of that, when it comes to actually dealing with someone like this in real life, comes down to one deceptively simple shift. You stop feeding the dynamic. Think carefully about what actually keeps this kind of manipulation alive. It survives entirely on your participation, your emotional reactions, your long, exhausting explanations, your deep human need to finally be understood by someone who was never actually listening to you in good faith to begin with. When you argue with someone like this, you are almost never having an actual conversation. You are feeding the exact dynamic that keeps them in the driver's seat. Every tear you shed, every defensive explanation you offer, every moment you spend second-guessing your own memory of events tells them, on some unconscious level, that what they're doing is still working. Over time, this creates a strange, disorienting kind of entanglement. You start operating inside their version of reality instead of trusting your own. You might notice yourself rehearsing conversations in your head before they even happen, trying to anticipate every possible twist so you won't get caught off guard. You might notice yourself apologizing for things you're not actually sorry for, just to keep the peace and move the conversation forward faster. You might notice a strange kind of fatigue that shows up after even brief interactions with them, a tiredness that doesn't quite match how short or ordinary the conversation seemed on the surface. All of that is a sign of how much energy it takes to constantly monitor and manage someone else's shifting version of events, energy that's being pulled away from your own life without you fully realizing it. But here's the genuinely good news in all of this. The moment you achieve real detachment, calm, conscious, deliberate distance, their grip on you starts to loosen almost immediately. I want to be completely clear that this isn't about going numb or shutting your emotions down entirely. It's closer to what therapists call observing without absorbing, seeing someone's behavior with total clarity without getting emotionally swept up in the current of it. Practically speaking, that means you stop participating in the drama altogether. You can watch someone's manipulation tactics unfold without absorbing them as truth. You can witness their behavior without internalizing it as some kind of verdict on your own worth. And this shift, small as it sounds on paper, tends to genuinely unsettle people who rely on your engagement to keep their sense of self propped up and functioning. When you stop chasing their validation, stop over-explaining yourself, and stop trying to make them finally understand your side of the story, you become someone they simply cannot get a foothold on anymore, and that alone changes the entire dynamic. Now here's the exact sentence I promised you. One line that speeds this whole process up almost instantly, and it works precisely because of how little it actually says. Are you ready for it? The sentence is this: I'm not available for this conversation. That's the whole thing. No drama attached to it, no accusation buried inside it, no defensiveness required to deliver it. Just a calm, simple statement of a boundary, spoken flatly and left alone. And it tends to be remarkably effective for a very specific reason. It doesn't attack anyone's ego, so there's nothing there for them to defend against or twist into a story where they're the victim. It isn't an explanation, so there's nothing for them to pick apart, argue with, or use to make you doubt your own perception all over again. It's simply a line. And calm, clean boundaries tend to be the one thing this kind of manipulative dynamic genuinely cannot survive contact with. People who rely on pulling others into circular, draining conversations, arguments that never actually go anywhere but somehow leave you completely exhausted every single time, depend entirely on your continued engagement to keep that cycle spinning. When you say, I'm not available for this conversation, you are quietly doing something far more powerful than it sounds. You are pulling your own energy back out of the dynamic entirely. You are choosing not to participate calmly and without needing to justify that choice to anyone, including yourself. Why does that unsettle someone who operates this way so profoundly? Because their entire sense of self often depends on your emotional engagement to stay propped up and stable. Take that engagement away completely, and they're left alone with the exact thing they've spent their whole life running from, the emptiness sitting underneath the mask they've built. I want to be honest with you about something else too. This sentence isn't magic, and it isn't a one-time fix you say once and then walk away having solved everything. It's a practice. The first time you say it, it might feel awkward, even a little unnatural, especially if you're used to over-explaining yourself in these situations out of habit. That's completely normal. Most people who've spent years inside a dynamic like this have been conditioned to believe that every disagreement requires a full explanation, a justification, evidence, proof that their feelings are valid. Unlearning that instinct takes repetition. The goal isn't to deliver the line perfectly. The goal is to keep choosing it again and again until it becomes second nature instead of something you have to force yourself to remember in the heat of the moment. This is also why the boundary works so well on a practical level. It genuinely can't be argued with. It can't be twisted into something it was never meant to be. It isn't an attack, so there's no opening for them to play the victim in front of others. It isn't an explanation, so there's nothing to pick apart or use to spin you back into confusion. It's simply a line, drawn calmly and held without wavering. But here's a fair warning, and it's important that you hear this part clearly before you try it. Things often get more intense before they get better. Stay with me, because understanding why that happens will help you recognize it as a sign the boundary is actually working, not a sign that you've done something wrong. When someone senses they're losing the kind of control they've grown used to having over you, they will often escalate, at least for a while. They might accuse you of being cold, distant, unfair, emotionally unavailable, even cruel. That escalation, uncomfortable as it absolutely feels in the moment, is usually solid evidence that the boundary is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You've disrupted a dynamic they depended on to feel stable, and that disruption tends to trigger a kind of anxious backlash, a scramble on their end to restore the old balance of power they're accustomed to holding. This is usually the point where people talk themselves out of holding the boundary, because the escalation feels like proof that they've made things worse rather than better. I want to gently push back on that instinct. Escalation isn't evidence that you failed. It's evidence that the old strategy stopped working and a new one is being tested out on you in real time. It might look like sudden warmth after weeks of coldness, a grand gesture, an apology that arrives with suspicious timing, or the exact opposite, a sudden coldness designed to punish you for stepping back. Both are attempts to pull you back into the old rhythm. Neither one requires you to respond with anything more than the same calm line you already have. What you're actually witnessing in that moment is discomfort, maybe even something close to their own private version of facing the emptiness they've spent years successfully avoiding. But if you can hold steady through that initial pushback without folding, something genuinely useful tends to happen over time. Staying consistent with a boundary like this builds real, lasting psychological growth, a version of reclaiming yourself that clinicians would recognize as authentic growth in practice. You get to reclaim a version of yourself that isn't constantly being pulled, reshaped, and rewritten by someone else's unresolved wounds. Every single time you calmly repeat some version of, "I'm not available for this conversation," you're reinforcing your own independence a little more, layer by layer. Eventually, most people operating this way come to realize they simply can't get through that boundary anymore, no matter what angle they try. They might test new tactics for a while, probing to see if the old approach still works somewhere along the edges. But your consistency, your quiet, steady refusal to keep engaging with the drama, breaks the pattern that used to pull you back in every single time without fail. I'd go so far as to say a boundary like this is more than just a sentence. It functions as a quiet declaration that your energy and attention are no longer available to be pulled into someone else's chaos on demand. And that tends to be genuinely destabilizing for someone who has built their entire way of relating to other people around being able to do exactly that whenever they want. What they're truly afraid of in that moment isn't losing you specifically as a person. It's losing their ability to avoid their own unresolved pain by managing and manipulating whoever happens to be standing closest to them. Here's where this whole idea leads somewhere much bigger than just handling one difficult relationship in your life. When you consistently hold a boundary like this one, you start moving towards something genuinely meaningful in your own psychological development, becoming more fully and solidly yourself, even while someone else is actively trying to pull you into their distorted version of reality. You become harder to shake, harder to fracture, because your sense of who you are stops depending on whether someone else understands you, agrees with you, or approves of you. And this shift doesn't just change one relationship in isolation, it tends to ripple outward into everything else. Once you've genuinely learned to recognize this pattern and hold your ground calmly and consistently, you get noticeably better at spotting it everywhere else too, in future relationships, in the workplace, even inside long-standing friendships. You start noticing the early warning signs of projection and manipulation well before they ever get a real hook into you. Maybe it's a coworker who consistently rewrites the story of a shared project to leave themselves looking flawless. Maybe it's a new friend who seems a little too invested in your admiration a little too quickly. Maybe it's a family member whose warmth seems to arrive right on schedule whenever they need something from you. Once you've done the work of understanding this pattern in one relationship, you carry that awareness with you everywhere, and it becomes far harder for the same dynamic to sneak up on you a second time. People who master this tend to become exactly what someone relying on control and confusion fears most in the world, someone who simply isn't available to be pulled in anymore. Not someone who can be drained, confused, or quietly steered. Someone who has calmly and permanently reclaimed their own footing. This is often the point where people describe feeling like they've gotten a piece of themselves back that they didn't even realize was missing. Decisions start feeling like your own again instead of pre-negotiated around someone else's moods. Ordinary days stop feeling like they need to be carefully managed to avoid setting something off. You start trusting your own memory of events again without needing a second opinion or a paper trail to feel sure of what actually happened. None of that happens overnight, and it's rarely a straight line from confusion to clarity, but each time you hold the boundary instead of collapsing it, you're laying down another brick in a foundation that eventually holds steady on its own. And maybe the most meaningful part of this entire process is that the shift was never really about the other person to begin with. It's about you. Every single time you honor a boundary like this one, you strengthen your own sense of self, the part of you that refuses to bend or blur just because someone else needs you to for their own comfort. Real freedom in situations like this almost never comes from successfully changing the other person. It comes from no longer needing them to change at all in order for you to feel steady, whole, and safe inside your own life. When you get genuinely comfortable with this kind of calm non-participation, you're not just protecting yourself from one difficult relationship. You're building a skill that carries you well beyond that single situation into every corner of your life. You start to realize you don't need to out-argue anyone, expose anyone publicly, or win some exhausting battle for the truth to finally be acknowledged. You just need to stop making yourself available for the parts of the relationship that were never healthy to begin with. And that, more than any clever argument you could ever construct, is what actually shifts the balance of power for good. Not anger, not the perfect comeback delivered at just the right moment, just steadiness, just quiet, unwavering consistency, just the simple repeated refusal to keep stepping into a dynamic that was never yours to fix in the first place. If any part of this resonated with something you're currently living through, I want you to take this seriously. You are allowed to stop explaining yourself to people who were never actually listening. You are allowed to protect your peace without first proving you deserve it. Healing from this kind of dynamic isn't about winning some final argument or getting the apology you feel owed. It's about quietly, steadily choosing yourself over and over until it stops feeling like a fight and starts feeling like your new normal. I also want to say something to whoever is watching this and recognizing their own life in every sentence. This isn't a small thing you're going through, even if the people around you don't fully understand why it's been so hard to walk away or why it's taken you this long to see the pattern clearly. Confusion like this is disorienting by design. It isn't a personal failing that you didn't see it sooner. The fact that you're here, listening, learning the language for what's been happening to you is already the beginning of something shifting. Insight like this doesn't undo the time that's already passed, but it changes everything about what happens from here forward. There's also something worth saying about what healing from this actually looks like in practice, because it rarely looks like a clean break followed by instant clarity. More often it looks messy. It looks like slipping back into old patterns sometimes and then catching yourself. It looks like feeling guilty for setting a boundary even when you know, logically, that the boundary is fair and necessary. It looks like grieving the version of the relationship you wish had been real, even while you're actively protecting yourself from the version that actually existed. All of that is normal. None of it means you're doing this wrong. Healing from a dynamic built on control and confusion is rarely linear, and giving yourself permission to move through it imperfectly is part of the process, not a departure from it. It also helps to remember that you don't need this person to ever admit what happened in order for your own healing to be real. A lot of people wait for that admission, hoping that if the other person finally sees it and says it out loud, everything will make sense and the pain will finally resolve. That admission may never come, and waiting for it can quietly keep you tethered to the relationship long after you've otherwise stepped away. Your healing doesn't need their confession. It only needs your own clarity, held steadily, one day at a time, whether or not they ever come around to seeing it the way you do. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If you found it useful, consider subscribing, and if you know someone who might genuinely need to hear this today, feel free to pass it along to them.